The Earth's ice caps and most of its glaciers are melting. But is it really the end of the world? Does it even make sense to invest in polar research when there are so many other problems closer to home? Today we'll hear from two researchers with experience in extreme climates, including working on the sea ice and examining the largest glacier outside of the North and South Poles.
Pushing the limits, how polar research can help our struggling planet.
So let's talk. Joining us in the studio today are the leaders of two flagship projects that are supported by the Swiss Polar Institute. Julia Schmale studies the Earth's atmosphere, especially how aerosols interact with clouds to influence and maybe accelerate polar warming. Julia has spent a lot of time working on Antarctic and Arctic climate expeditions, including the Mosaic expedition, which drifted for a year on the Arctic sea ice. Welcome, Julia.
Thanks, it's nice to be here.
Francesca Pellicciotti specializes in hydrology and what's called the third pole. That's high mountain glaciers across the world, from the Andes to Asia. She's just come back from Tajikistan, where she's been studying a glacier that's actually growing rather than shrinking. We'll have more on that later. Welcome, Francesca.
Thank you, Susan. It's very nice to be here and to be here with Julia.
Excellent. Now, to kick off this conversation, we have literally got an icebreaker. This is footage of the Polarstern, and Julia has spent a lot of time on board that. It's an ice-breaking ship that researchers from all over the world have traveled on. Can you tell us what's it like on board?
Yeah, so actually I enjoy very much being on icebreakers. On the one hand, it's a very routine-dominated life. You know, there is the weather briefing at 8 in the morning, there is the science briefings at 6 in the evening. The meals are, of course, fixed, and it's very organized when we can go on the ice and when not, for safety reasons, of course. But on the other hand, it's also very unpredictable. So one thing I always like to do in the morning, first thing, even before breakfast, go on the bridge where you have the view across the ice, take the binoculars and have a look at where are our instruments, because the sea ice is moving. So where we left the instruments in the evening, it might not be the same place where they are in the morning. That also means to go and get the data from the instruments, check them. We always need to find a new path across the ice. So it's unpredictable, and it's a bit like doing scouting, but at the same time, we're also doing science there, and it's anything but straightforward to get really good data from these regions.
And it makes your work quite unpredictable. And speaking of unpredictable, what about the polar bears?
Yeah, this is one factor one needs to be aware of when working on sea ice in the Arctic. So whenever we go out, we go in a team, and one person is the dedicated polar bear guard. So they don't do anything else but watching out for polar bears. And once we would see one in the distance, we call the bridge by the radio, and they will help us find the best way and the quickest way back to the ship.
Any close calls?
Close calls, no, but we had around 60 polar bears that were visiting our ice floe.
Wow. It's quite something. Well, Francesca, what about you? What sort of wildlife or extreme conditions do you have to cope with in the high mountains?
Yes, I think they're completely different. This is the third pole. It's high compared to the other two poles, which are rather flat. Can I say that, Julia? So it's high, and the first thing you need to be prepared for is elevation, in fact. It's probably the highest risk you might have. There are pumas in the Andes. We had a sort of an encounter from far away. There are yaks in the Himalaya, and our camp was visited at night by yaks that were roaming around. But I really think the highest risk is high elevation sickness. We had a couple of accidents with that. There is a protocol to follow. Starting from 2,500 meters, you need to gain 500 meters elevation every day. You cannot do more. So this means that you have a slow ascent up to the camps and the glaciers. Our camps are between 4,000 and 5,600 meters, so it's really quite extreme. We had a terrible accident, in fact, happening to a Nepali young university student, a female. A wonderful girl, full of strength and courage, but we needed to take her down. It was late afternoon. She was sick and she didn't say anything. It's a matter of proud and cultural differences. She didn't say anything. We needed to take her down at night. The helicopter could not fly anymore in the afternoon. They cannot fly because of air storms and air currents. And so that was a crazy descent in the night, 5 people carrying her on the shoulders. And then the helicopter came the next day. She was for 3 weeks in hospital. It's been a terrible experience. One learns a lot from. Sonika then came with us the next season for the same expedition. And she came to visit in Europe. She did a PhD. This was a very nice story in the end, but yes, it can be tough.
Sounds pretty scary. I mean, I get altitude sickness as well, but the mountains here aren't anywhere near as high, so I can only imagine.
That is the point. I guess the second thing you need to prepare for is walking. I mean, Julia is on a ship, and we need to walk 2 to 3 to 7 days to reach the glaciers, and you don't walk alone. So you need to be prepared to share your life in a tent, in a camp, with people that, you'll be with for 2, 3, 4 weeks. I think these are the 3 main things: people, walking, and elevation. You need to be prepared for.
And living in close quarters also on the ship, I'm sure.
That's very similar. It's not a tent.
It's not the elevation.
It's 2 or 4 people in cabins. That's right. Yeah.
Yes, that is.
Bunk bed style, or
yeah, like youth hostel style. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you're both clearly passionate about your work and what's happening in these remote regions. But for many of us, it's pretty easy to ignore what's happening in places where we'll probably never go. What was it that made you decide to dedicate your life's work to these fields?
Yeah, so for me it was in the beginning coincidental, I would say. So when I started my PhD, it happened to be the International Polar Year. And so we did field measurements flying across Greenland in research aircraft to measure the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And I just got hooked to the polar region. I mean, you get a bird's eye view. It's beautiful. And at the same time, you see the meltwater lakes on the Greenland ice sheet. And that was something that really struck me. And then it was clear to me I want to learn more about climate change in these regions. And it's so fast that, within the lifetime of being a scientist, you can really see the changes and you can study the changes. And so this brought me to polar science.
What about you, Francesca? I think in my case was a fascination for the mountains. I mean, the poles are incredible, of course, but I have some mountain blood. My father comes from the mountains. He used to take us there. I think his fascination for the mountains and the mountain people, the people living there, this connection with the people living there is a very important part of my work and what makes this work so exciting too. A fascination for nature. I did environmental engineering. I remember being small and watching documentaries, in fact, on polar bears, these fantastic documentaries that really hooked me too. I think, as Julia said, though, chance is a key aspect in a scientific career in general, I would say. In my case, I was really looking for a PhD in Europe. I got an offer from Zurich. It was written mountain hydrology. I had no experience of glaciology. And I read mountain, and then I came for the interview, and it followed. I think the point is that once you get hooked, as Julia said, you are hooked. I mean, the mountains will not let you go. I have to say...
the mountains are calling. Isn't that an expression they say, right?
Yeah. The mountains are calling, not the people living there. I think these are some of the most generous and charming and hospitable people. This is my experience from the Andes to Nepal to Tibet to Tajikistan now. People living there are extremely generous, extremely hospitable. Yeah.
Now, something you were saying, Julia, earlier was about how in your scientific life you've already seen a lot of changes. Is there something in particular you could tell us about the Arctic sea ice, or?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, the Arctic sea ice, even when we were there with the Mosaic expedition, there was a minimum early on in the fall and then in the previous spring. And there was something that really struck me, which is not so much comparing multiple years, but I'm still going to tell that because it really struck me. We were on an expedition in 2018, that was before Mosaic, on a Swedish icebreaker where we were doing our research camp at the North Pole, and it rained. And this is something I would never have expected, that in the middle of September it would start raining at the North Pole. For me, it's snow there, but not liquid rain, and that really struck me.
Wow. That is something. I mean, and meanwhile, we know that the glaciers in Switzerland are melting at an alarming rate. A study just came out that said 2022 has been the worst year. They've lost 6% of their volume. We at Swissinfo have been working on a series of climate change explainer videos, and this one shows what's been happening to the Swiss glaciers.
Since 1850, Swiss glaciers have lost 60% of their volume. Switzerland is set to lose an important water reservoir as the glaciers continue to melt, affecting farming, hydropower production and transport on Europe's main waterways.
So the Swiss glaciers are melting, but Francesca, you're looking at a rather surprising phenomenon, and that's a glacier that is actually growing in another part of the world. What are you learning about it?
It's not only one glacier, Susan, it's a multitude of glaciers. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of glaciers in this region, which is called the Pamir-Karakorum anomaly, in fact. So it's a region of Central Asia, which is at the far west of the Himalaya and Hindu Kush chains. And it comprises part of the Chinese and Pakistani Karakorum, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, etc. So the Central Asia glaciers. We know about this anomalous behavior since 6 or 8 years, I would say, maximum, and we know that from satellites only. So these very large satellite studies that started from which you can derive the mass losses. You can see the thinning or the growing of glaciers with large uncertainties, I would say. But they were starting pointing maybe, 8 or 10 years ago maximum to this anomalous behavior. And then with increasing resolution and quality of satellite data, satellite images, in fact, you could see where these anomalous patterns were. These are glaciers that are either stable or growing. And we don't know the reasons for. Our flagship project, our flagship initiative project called Pamir, in fact, just started and deals with this. So I think in 4 years, hopefully, we will have an answer. But there are three distinct hypotheses, and maybe it's a combination of them. The first hypothesis is that temperatures are cooling during summer. There is very little evidence about this. The second hypothesis is instead that there is more winter precipitation that brings mass to the glaciers and makes them grow. And the third hypothesis, which is extremely fascinating, I feel, because this is a man-made effect. There's been a study showing that the largest irrigated system, which is somewhere in Pakistan, downstream of those regions, evaporates a huge amount of water that goes back into the atmosphere and is transported back on those regions and then falls as precipitation and as solid precipitation, so as snow. And this is extremely fascinating. We are starting now to work on all these three hypotheses. As I said, hopefully in 4 years we will have an answer. But we don't know why they are growing. And there is another aspect to this, that there is also, only from satellite studies, increasing evidence that the anomaly might be at a turning point. So we might be losing now those unique glaciers that are growing. There are very few ground data. This is why we have been now. So we also have field campaigns and collection of data in situ. And as I said, this is a unique situation. It's extremely fascinating. In whole high mountain Asia, it's the only area where glaciers are either stable or growing.
That sounds like a fascinating mystery to unravel.
It is. But it's not a mystery. I don't know if we're a mystery in science. But definitely when you go there, you see something you've never seen before. You see glaciers that are level with the terrain compared to our alpine or Andean glaciers, where the glaciers have been losing mass and really going down compared to the terrain. There you walk on the glacier. This is something I'd never seen before going there a year ago.
Must be amazing. Well, and one thing we know for sure also is that this kind of research, as interesting as it is, it's very expensive, it's very time-consuming, and there might be people who say, well, why should this be a priority for Switzerland? Maybe, Julia, you could say why you think that the Swiss Polar Institute feels that you should have this Green Fjord project in Greenland.
Yeah, so I mean, generally, even though the polar regions are far from where we live, there is no isolated region in the Earth system, so to speak. So climate change is happening globally everywhere, and what we humans have caused, so by putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're warming our Earth. That, of course, has a strong impact on all the poles, including the third pole. And so the poles are not isolated from our actions, and we we are also not isolated from the consequences that happen in the polar region. So, for example, the Greenland ice sheet is melting, and that has a very strong contribution to sea level rise. And while Switzerland is not located at the sea, there is countries in Europe or other countries like Bangladesh who will very clearly feel the consequences of that. So this is something very direct, or something that we also can read about in the media a lot. Maybe something that is not that direct or that well known is the atmospheric circulation patterns that will change. So our weather here in Switzerland is partly influenced by the sea ice state. So is it a big extent, is it a small extent? And that has a role for what type of precipitation we get here or what are winter temperatures. So in a way, we're directly influenced, and from a scientific perspective, if we want to have more certain scenarios for the future, how is our climate going to develop here, then we need to be very informed about what is happening in the poles, because they're changing quite rapidly. So we need to integrate that in our numerical simulations of the future climate.
And there are, yes, it's very true. It's perfect explanation. But I think there are also indirect consequences. A lot of the countries I work on are countries where people migrate from away and into our rich Western countries, from Peru to Nepal. And this will increase in the future because of climate change, climate refugees, etc. I was reading a UN report from last year. They said 18 million people are on the move because of wars, and 23 because of climate change, extreme events. It's more than war. So climate change is causing more people to be on the move than actual wars. And the two often are also connected. So I think if we want to stop that, to keep those people there and give them a sustainable life, is fundamental that Switzerland act. And Switzerland is also a center of trade. I mean, Switzerland's self-sufficiency in terms of food, for instance, food security, it's only 50 to 60%. All the rest comes from other countries. And some of that food comes from, for instance, Peru. And we have a project in Peru to study the glaciers there and the impact on agriculture. And Peru is already at a threshold in terms of water availability. So there are already water conflicts in the region between the local communities growing their potatoes and other similar crops and the very large industrial agriculture. And if those conflicts exacerbate, there will be impact also on food security in Europe, for instance.
Hey, as you both say, everything is connected to everything.
Everything is connected.
Everybody
Everything
is connected. Right, and international collaboration then has to be key.
It is key.
Definitely,
It is key.
yes. But as one of my colleagues at Swissinfo reported recently, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is really making this hard, especially in the Arctic. For example, there were many soil and vegetation samples that Swiss researchers had gathered on a Russian icebreaker, but these are still in Russia. They haven't been able to access them. We also on Swissinfo have a blog going from some polar researchers who are based at the ETH. And right now they're on Svalbard, and they're working in a place that's populated by both Russians and Ukrainians. And they were telling me how their institution wouldn't allow them to use Russian boat services. And they also couldn't stay at a hotel in a Russian settlement. They instead had to charter a sailboat and sleep on that to do their field work. I'm guessing you might have experienced something similar in your work on account of the Russian-Ukraine war.
Yeah, I mean, there is some different dimensions to it. So actually, my laboratory was also part of this cruise on a Russian icebreaker last summer, where the soil samples now are stuck. In that case, we were lucky because we have just digitalized data, which was actually transferred then by the Russian ministries just while the war started, actually. So that was a close call, so to speak. But now we have the data and can work with that. However, evidently this project is a collaboration between European countries and Russian countries. And now when we have the meetings, of course, half of the team is missing. This is one dimension, for example. Another one, I'm a member of an expert group for the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, where we've worked on establishing what is the climate impact of climate forcers that are shorter lived than the greenhouse gases. So, for example, black carbon. And the measurements we rely on, of course, come from everywhere in the Arctic, and Russia has a big part of the Arctic. And so we've been working with these colleagues for multiple years now to come up with this this assessment. And now very close to the publication of that, all of a sudden it's very difficult to have this communication. I think again in this case we were lucky because most of the work has been done and there's nothing that will stop it going forward now. But I imagine for the next round of the assessment this is going to be more difficult to get updated information from Russia, and also our colleagues will have more difficulties in participating in the Arctic Council work that we are doing.
And what about interpersonal? I mean, are there people that you might still privately be emailing, even if you're not officially able to work together?
In our case, a major disruption was this Pamir Karakoram anomaly, this Pamir anomalous state of glaciers that are stable or growing, those glaciers have been studied by Russian Soviet Union scientists. And we have, in fact, an historian in our project to try to understand what the Russian scientists found and whether they were aware, for instance, that those glaciers were in an anomalous state. Now, access to all archives in Moscow and St. Petersburg has been closed. So this is a major part of the project needs to be redirected and reoriented. This is a major obstacle for Pamir as a whole, not for our research on the actual Central Asian glaciers, but to understand what was happening in the past. Christine was in contact with Russian scientists, and this also had to stop. It has to stop. What I've seen in Dushanbe, which is the capital city of Tajikistan, just a few days before flying out, because of Putin conscription now, plenty of young male Russians are escaping the country and heading towards all the satellite, the former Soviet Union Republic, and Tajikistan too. So these people were flooding the country. All the hotels were full. We were coming back one day earlier and there was no room available for us. It was really, for us it's a minor nuisance, but it's heartbreaking to see these young men leaving Russia because of that. So that is something you see, first.
Well, the urgency for them to get out, but we've also got this real sense of urgency for climate change. Many of the latest reports saying that we're at a tipping point now. There's not much time left to reduce global warming because the consequences for humanity and the environment will be just unimaginable.
Yes.
I'm kind of curious, also your work requires a lot of travel. How do you square flying to a remote region with the general call for people to fly less and be very mindful of their carbon footprints?
In my group, we have a policy, and I think this is also ETA policy, that nobody travels by flight in Europe. We take trains everywhere. We do that also as a family, but we do it for the group. So we travel by train, including to the UK, and I think it's a very nice change of mindset. And that is one thing we do. I guess the other thing, we discuss this a lot, and some of the young PhD students are extremely committed to that. In fact, one of them said, I'm not coming to Tajikistan only for 10 days. And I had to accept that. I'm not forcing him to fly. What I think we try to do is that we don't fly almost anywhere for a few days. So once you fly, you spend time there. One of my PhD students then went to visit a very remote new university. So they spend there maybe 2 months. Then they do their field work. We spend some time teaching at university. So you maximize the impact of that long distance flight. But I think that awareness is super important. Yes.
Exactly. So it's very similar at EPFL. There is a travel policy so that we use trains for certain distances, so all over Europe, that actually supports us also in planning our travel. And then I think the other thing that you said, long distance travel needs to be meaningful and impactful. So just for a couple of days is what we completely avoid. This is not really happening anymore. And also for many conferences, they happen in hybrid format now. And this is all alternatives that are now happening. And perhaps one point I can add for the big Mosaic expedition where we drift with an icebreaker in the middle of the Arctic for an entire year, where of course the engines are running all the time to keep the power on and keep us warm. We are doing a full environmental impact assessment to understand. And so it is not only fossil fuel combustion, it's also light pollution, it's grey water that's being let into the water, and so on. on and so forth. So there's many aspects that are being considered and that are also being made public after that research has been done. So it's all traceable.
Sounds like a lot going on then with that.
Yes, I think it's really quite recent, no, Julia? But I
Yes.
think there is so much awareness at the moment, especially I think in an environmental engineering department, environmental science department. It's a bit less like chemistry or material sciences, but I think there is a lot of awareness now.
And in general, what's your experience taught you that humanity is capable of? I mean, are we up to this challenge, this climate change challenge?
Well, it's
meeting targets?
perhaps one could say it's one of the biggest challenges that humanity has faced. So if we look at the facts, by the end of this decade, we need to halve our greenhouse gas emissions. By the half of the century, we should have net negative emissions. So we should have acted, of course, yesterday or much before yesterday. So it's a huge technological challenge, but also societal and behavioral challenge. So it's on all ends, and that means that there can also be many, many actors then can promote climate action. And this is, of course, a huge challenge, but I'm very convinced humanity has already tackled so many challenges. We can also tackle this challenge, but we need to want it. That's the key point.
Yes, I completely agree with what Julia said. It's such a multifaceted problem to tackle. That means that there are so many actors that can act. I think one of those actors, though, are scientists now. When I did my PhD, that was about 20 years ago or so, there were no discussion that scientists could be so politically engaged as they are now, or activist as they are now. And that is a paradigm shift that happened probably 10 years ago or something like this, when scientists really started to speak loud. Before there was this idea, you as a scientist, you do your science, it's objective, it's facts, you produce the facts, and then somebody will act on those. Whereas now I feel that the scientific community at large, and probably our scientific community even more, I mean, we see those glaciers disappear, is extremely committed and more engaged in society. I think this is a great change. The young people are extremely active, I feel. I still think there is dismay what we are seeing now, right? This is a changes of dramatic, epic proportions. I'm worried, I have to say. I'm worried for our son. The world in which he will be living in scares me. There is a quotation from this great philosopher and political thinker, an Italian, Gramsci, who died in a fascist prison. So those times were really hard times. And he said, what we need is the pessimism of reason. Our intelligence cannot deny the fact, and the facts are dismaying, but the optimism of will. And this is really what I take inside me all the time. I mean, if you only analyze rationally the facts, yes, I mean, you cannot but being pessimistic. But I think there is an optimism of will that I see in so many sectors of society and groups that then my will is optimistic still, I think.
Well, that sounds like a hopeful and optimistic note to end on. Thank you so much, Francesca. Thank you, Julia, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching Let's Talk. Visit us at swissinfo.ch or follow us on social media to find out about future episodes. Speak soon.